After their tense meeting with Nezra, Gunner and Derren made their way toward Velara's stronghold. Unlike Nezra's cold, calculated fortress, Velara's domain was a stark contrast. It was a place of opulence and ambition, with towering spires and banners of rich crimson hanging from the walls. The land surrounding it was more alive than Nezra's, but there was an underlying tension, as though the realm itself was holding its breath. "Okay," Derren muttered, eyeing the grandiosity of the place. "This looks more like someone who wants to be queen." Gunner grunted in agreement. The lush gardens and well-maintained walkways were a sign that Velara had no intention of hiding her ambitions. But there was something else, a feeling in the air that made Gunner's skin crawl. The dark magic that had been so prevalent in their battle with Ultranacious seemed to pulse faintly here just beneath the surface. They were led through a grand entrance hall and into a large chamber. Unlike Nezra's dimly lit fortress, Velara's hall was brightly illuminated with glowing crystals that lined the walls, casting a golden hue over everything. At the far end of the room, Velara sat on a throne of polished silver, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed arrogance as she watched them approach. "Ah, Gunner," she said, her voice smooth but laced with venom. "The man who killed my father. And who's this?" Her eyes flicked to Derren, assessing him with mild interest. "Your new squire?" Derren raised an eyebrow. "Wow, first time meeting and you're already throwing shade. I'm impressed." Velara's lips curled into a smirk. "You'll find I'm not one to waste time with pleasantries." Gunner's expression remained impassive as he stood before her, but Derren could feel the tension radiating off him. Unlike with Nezra, the hostility here wasn't masked. It was on full display. "Lissandra sent us," Gunner said, his voice calm but direct. "She's trying to keep this realm from falling apart." Velara's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, my dear sister," she purred. "Always so noble, so concerned with doing what's right." She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with amusement. "But you and I both know that right doesn't win wars, Gunner. Power does." Gunner's jaw tightened, but it was Derren who stepped forward. "You know, for someone who claims to understand power, it's interesting how you're so focused on tearing down your own family. Seems like a waste of resources if you ask me." Velara's eyes snapped to Derren, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "And what would a mortal like you know of power?" Derren shrugged, his tone casual. "I know that when people start fighting over scraps, they miss the bigger picture. You want control? Sure. But if you tear everything apart in the process, what exactly are you ruling over?" Velara's expression darkened, but she didn't immediately retort. Instead, she studied Derren, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her throne. "You think I'm short-sighted?" "I think you're ambitious," Derren replied smoothly. "But ambition without direction tends to backfire. You want to rule this place, fine. But doing it by fighting your sisters and turning this realm into a battleground isn't going to get you what you want. You'll just end up ruling a pile of rubble." Velara's eyes narrowed, but Derren could see the gears turning in her mind. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like him. But instead of snapping back, she leaned back in her throne, her gaze flicking between Gunner and Derren. "And what do you propose?" she asked, her voice quieter but no less dangerous. "That I simply bend the knee to Lissandra? Let her reign while I sit in the shadows?" Derren shook his head. "No, I'm saying you play smart. You and your sisters could be a united front, keeping this realm safe from whatever's still lurking in the shadows. Because, let's face it, your dad's magic didn't just vanish. You all know it's still out there, waiting." Velara's fingers stilled, her eyes narrowing. She didn't answer, but Derren could see the wheels turning. Gunner remained silent, letting Derren handle the conversation, knowing his usual straightforward approach wouldn't work here. Finally, Velara stood, her gaze hard as she looked down at them. "I won't let Lissandra rule me, but I'll hear what you have to say, Gunner. For now." Gunner nodded. "Good," We'll take that as a step forward. As they turned to leave, Derren couldn't help but smirk, glancing over his shoulder at Velara. By the way, I'd hold on to that ambition of yours. Just aim it at something that won't get you, and the realm, killed. Velara said nothing, her eyes gleaming with something Derren couldn't quite read. The halls of Ultranacious's castle loomed ahead, still bearing the scars of battles long past. The dark, towering structure was a reminder of their father's reign, a place that held as much fear as it did power. Lissandra had suggested they meet here for a reason. If they were to rebuild, they had to face the past. But getting her sisters to agree to come was no easy feat. Inside one of the side chambers, Gunner and Derren stood, awaiting the arrival of Nezra and Velara. Lissandra paced the room, her expression tense. She wasn't convinced they would come. After everything that had happened, her sisters had no reason to trust her, no reason to even consider peace. "They'll come," Derren said confidently, leaning against the wall. He had been the one to convince them. Nezra and Velara had wanted nothing to do with this gathering, until Derren had made a promise of protection and, more importantly, a chance to see what Lissandra had accomplished since her father's fall. "I hope you're right," Lissandra murmured. "If they don't, this could all fall apart before it even starts." Gunner remained silent, his gaze fixed on the doorway. If Nezra and Velara didn't show, the realm's fragile peace would be in jeopardy. But he trusted Derren's instincts. The man had a way with people that Gunner never did. Sometimes charm and sarcasm worked where brute force couldn't. Moments later, the heavy doors creaked open, and Nezra entered, followed closely by Velara. Both sisters walked in with the same air of caution and distrust that had defined their previous meetings, but the fact that they had come at all was a victory in itself. "Impressive," Velara remarked as she looked around the room, her sharp gaze taking in the surroundings. "Our father's castle hasn't seen this much activity in years." Nezra remained silent, her eyes lingering on Lissandra with barely concealed suspicion. Lissandra straightened, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you both for coming. I know this isn't easy, but we need to talk about the future of the realm, about what we can achieve together." Nezra crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And why should we believe anything you say? You've had your chance to rule, and now you expect us to follow blindly?" Derren cleared his throat, stepping forward before the tension could escalate. "Hold up. No one's asking for blind loyalty. What Lissandra's offering is a chance to see for yourselves what she's done in such a short time. If nothing else, it's an opportunity to make sure this realm doesn't crumble under outside threats. And I think you'd both agree that's worth checking out." Velara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the way Derren cut through the political nonsense. "And if we find her efforts lacking?" Derren grinned. "Then we're back to square one. But based on what I've seen, I think you'll be surprised. She's turned things around faster than anyone expected." There was a beat of silence before Nezra finally relented with a sigh. "Fine. But this doesn't mean we trust her. We'll see what she's done." Lissandra nodded, visibly relieved. "That's all I ask." The negotiations began in earnest, the sisters exchanging thinly veiled barbs as they discussed the future of the realm. But just when it seemed like progress was being made, Velara's voice dropped, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "I know about the army," Velara said suddenly, her words slicing through the conversation like a blade. The room went still. "What army?" Lissandra asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Velara leaned back in her chair, her smile cold. "There's a small force gathering in the northern mountains. They're planning to strike your lands, Lissandra. Apparently, not everyone is convinced you're fit to rule." Gunner's gaze sharpened, and even Derren felt the shift in the air. "How do you know this?" Lissandra demanded, her hands clenching into fists. Velara shrugged. "I have my ways. Let's just say I'm not the only one who's been keeping tabs on things. I thought it best you know before they make their move." The revelation hung heavy in the air. What had begun as a tense negotiation had just become a race against time. If an army was gathering, then the realm was in more danger than any of them had realized. The tension in the room was palpable. After Velara's revelation about the army, the sisters exchanged uneasy glances, each weighing their options carefully. Gunner, standing with his arms crossed, broke the silence first. "Will you fight?" His voice was steady, eyes scanning each of the sisters in turn. Lissandra, without hesitation, stepped forward. "Of course. I'll defend my people, whether you join me or not." Nezra and Velara, however, were more cautious. Nezra's arms remained crossed, her expression unreadable, while Velara's sharp eyes flicked between Gunner and her sisters. "Why should we fight?" Velara asked, her voice measured. "The threat is against Lissandra, not us." Gunner's jaw tightened. "And you think it'll stop there?" He stepped forward, his cybernetic arm gleaming in the dim light. "If this army defeats Lissandra, what's to stop them from turning on you next? Unless, of course," he added, his voice dropping with suspicion, "one of you is behind it." The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the room grew colder. Velara's expression hardened, and Nezra's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you accusing us of conspiracy?" Nezra hissed. Derren, sensing the tension reaching a breaking point, quickly stepped in, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, let's all take a breath here." He glanced between the sisters, his tone light but serious. "Nobody's accusing anyone of anything, except maybe being a little too eager to assume the worst." Velara's gaze softened slightly, but her stance remained defensive. "He implied it." Derren flashed her a grin, stepping a little closer. "Look, I get it. Gunner's not exactly the let's talk about our feelings kind of guy. But what he's saying makes sense. If this army takes out Lissandra, what's to stop them from marching on your lands next?" Velara opened her mouth to retort, but Derren held up a finger, cutting her off. "And even if they aren't targeting you now, it doesn't mean they won't. You both know how these things go. Power vacuums don't stay empty for long. It's in all of your best interests to stand together." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Derren's words sinking in. Velara and Nezra exchanged a glance, their earlier hostility giving way to consideration. "I will personally lead the forces to defend the realm," Gunner said, breaking the silence. His tone was firm, unyielding. "I've fought worse before." But before he could continue, Lissandra stepped forward, placing herself between Gunner and her sisters. "No," she said quietly but firmly. "This is not your fight, Gunner. It's ours. I'll lead the defense of my realm, whether my sisters join me or not." Gunner's brow furrowed, but he remained silent. Lissandra's resolve was clear, and he knew better than to challenge it. Nezra's gaze shifted between Lissandra and Velara, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't afford to let this realm fall, not to an outside force. I'll stand with you." Velara hesitated, her sharp eyes locking onto Lissandra's. There was a flicker of something, pride perhaps, before she nodded. "We'll stand together," she said quietly. "We'll lead together." The sisters stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared decisions settling over them. For the first time in what felt like ages, they were united, not by love or trust, but by necessity. Derren let out a low whistle, glancing over at Gunner. "Well, I'd say that went better than expected." Gunner simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the sisters. "We've got a battle to prepare for." Gunner took Derren aside, his expression serious as he readied Starbreaker. The weight of the upcoming battle hung heavy in the air, and Gunner's mind was already racing through strategies. He looked Derren in the eye, sensing the tension. "Derren," Gunner began, his voice low and steady. "This will be unlike any battle you've ever fought. You're walking into a war against creatures and forces that won't play by the rules. If you want to step back, no one would blame you." Derren raised an eyebrow, trying to mask the slight unease creeping up inside him with his usual sarcasm. Step back? Please. And miss out on the fun? Not a chance. But beneath his quip, there was an understanding that Gunner wasn't exaggerating. I'm serious, Gunner continued. This is going to be brutal. I'm taking Alpha to scout the enemy's position, but I'm leaving you here. Your job is to keep the sisters from tearing each other apart while I'm gone. Maintain the peace between them, or we'll have an internal war before the real one even begins. Derren's expression shifted, more serious now as he nodded. He knew Gunner wasn't just leaving him behind to play mediator. He was trusting him with one of the most volatile parts of the mission. All right, I'll keep things from blowing up here, but you better come back in one piece. Gunner gave a rare, faint smile. I always do. As Gunner finished preparing Starbreaker, Derren took a moment to inspect his shotgun. With a grin, he decided to give his weapon a proper name, tapping the engraved barrel. Thunderstrike it is, he said to himself, taking comfort in the steady hum of the enchanted rounds locked and loaded. With Starbreaker ready and Alpha by his side, Gunner glanced at Derren one last time. Keep your wits about you, Derren. We'll need everything to hold together if we're going to win this. Yeah, Derren replied, his smirk returning as he hefted Thunderstrike over his shoulder. You go play scout. I'll babysit the bickering queens. Gunner nodded, turning toward the shadows where Alpha was waiting. With the weight of the realm on his shoulders, Gunner disappeared into the night, ready to confront whatever forces lay ahead. Derren made his way back into the chamber where the sisters had gathered, each of them in their own corner, keeping distance from one another. Nezra sat with her arms crossed, her face as cold as ice, while Velara leaned casually against a pillar, inspecting her nails, clearly unbothered by the situation, or pretending to be. As he entered, they both turned their attention to him. Where's Gunner? Velara asked, her voice edged with suspicion. He didn't run off, did he? Derren smiled, though there was a tightness to it. Nah, he's gone to scout the enemy. Thought it might be a good idea to know what we're up against before we dive headfirst into battle. He let his words hang in the air for a moment before adding, He took Alpha with him, so I'm sticking around to make sure things here don't fall apart. Nezra's eyes narrowed. And what makes you think we need your help to keep things together? Nah, Derren shot her a wink, leaning against the back of a nearby chair. Well, from what I've seen so far, let's just say it's better if someone's here to make sure the sisters don't start a civil war before the real fight begins. Velara snorted, though it was clear she wasn't entirely dismissive of his words. And you think you can stop that? I've got a talent for smoothing things over, Derren replied, still calm, still trying to lighten the atmosphere. Besides, Gunner trusts me to keep you lot from killing each other. For a moment the room was silent, the sisters exchanging unreadable glances. Derren knew that the peace here was fragile, and Gunner's absence was only making things tenser. He stepped forward, keeping his tone light but his words firm. Look, he began, I get it. Trust isn't exactly abundant around here, but whether you like it or not, you're all in this together now. So let's not waste time bickering while there's an army gathering to knock on our door. We can save the family feuds for later. Nezra's eyes flickered with something. Maybe annoyance, maybe grudging acceptance, while Velara raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying Derren's boldness. And why should we listen to you? Nezra asked, her voice cold as ever. Because, Derren said, grinning in that infuriating way he had, if you don't, you'll miss the chance to be the hero of this whole mess. And trust me, everyone loves a hero. Velara smirked. Nezra, however, simply exhaled sharply but didn't argue further. Derren took that as a small victory.
Well, you found your way to the end, haven't you? That must mean you're curious, and we love curiosity around here. Before you vanish into the ether, take a moment to subscribe. It's just a click, and trust me, you'll want to stay in the loop for what comes next. And while you're at it, give the video a like. The energy exchange is good for you. Hit that notification bell too. You wouldn't want to miss out on any of our magical misadventures. Who knows what I might conjure up next? Alright, off you go. But remember, I'll know if you didn't subscribe. See you on the other side.